They laughed the first morning Thomas Reed let the coffee trucks roll through the fog. Not one truck, not two. A whole line of them crawled down the gravel road before sunrise, their headlights floating between the fir trees like ghosts. And when the first trailer tipped backward, a mountain of wet black coffee grounds slid onto Thomas Reed's dead pasture with a sound like mud collapsing. The smell hit the valley before daylight did. Bitter, sour, heavy. By noon, people in town were already calling it Reed's Coffee Cemetery. His neighbors said he had turned a farm into a landfill. Children on the school bus held their noses when they passed. Even Thomas's own son, Jonah, stood on the porch that morning and wondered if grief had finally broken his father for good. But 6 summers later, when the dry heat burned nearly every hayfield outside Grants Pass, Oregon, one strange black field stayed green. That was when the coffee company came back. Because the waste they had paid Thomas Reed to take away had quietly become the most valuable dirt in the county. And they wanted it back. The first delivery arrived in January of 1994, just before 5 in the morning. Cold fog sat low over the Reed farm, thick enough to swallow the fence posts. The pasture behind the barn was silver with frost. Beyond it, the dark line of Douglas firs stood perfectly still under a pale winter moon. Jonah Reed woke to the hiss of air brakes outside his bedroom window. At first, he thought a logging truck had missed the curve again. That happens sometimes when ice slicked the county road. Men came down too fast from the hills, touched the brakes wrong, and ended up sideways in the ditch. Then another engine growled. Then another. Jonah sat up, listening. The whole valley seemed to be breathing diesel. He was 23 years old, tall, narrow-hipped, and strong in the way farm sons become strong without ever thinking about it. His brown hair was always a little too long. His hands were rough before he was old enough to vote. And lately, his face carried the tired look of a young man who had already learned that land could break a family just as easily as feed one. The Reed place had been in trouble for years. A dry stretch in 1989 had cut their hay yield nearly in half. The irrigation pump failed the next spring. Then came a tractor engine repair they could not afford, and a bank officer who smiled too much while explaining late fees. But the real wound in the house was Ruth Reed. Jonah's mother had died in 1990 after 2 quiet years of sickness that no one in the family knew how to talk about. Before she died, Thomas Reed had been a man who sang badly while fixing fence posts and laughed at jokes long after everyone else stopped. After Ruth was buried, he became quieter than winter soil. He still worked. He still paid what he could. He still helped neighbors pull cabs, patch roofs, and move irrigation pipe when storms came through. But something warm had gone out of him. Jonah pulled on his boots without changing clothes and stepped outside in a faded thermal shirt and a denim jacket stiff with cold. The smell reached him on the porch. Coffee. Not warm coffee from a kitchen. Wet coffee. Old coffee. The kind of smell that comes from a restaurant dumpster after rain. Down by the back pasture, 4 trucks idled in a line. Their white trailers looked enormous in the fog. More headlights waited behind them on the road. And at the fence stood Thomas Reed. He was 62, broad through the chest, with a gray beard cut short against a weathered jaw. His blue eyes rarely gave much away anymore. He wore patched canvas coveralls under a brown work coat, and in one hand he held a chipped mug with steam rising from it. Jonah walked through the frosted grass toward him. "What is this?" Thomas did not turn. "They're early." "Who is early?" The first trailer lifted. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then, thousands of pounds of black coffee grounds poured out in a wet avalanche, slamming onto the frozen pasture and spreading like tar. Steam rose from the pile into the dark air. Jonah stared. "You're letting them dump that here?" Thomas took a slow drink from his mug. "They're paying by the load." "That doesn't answer me." "It answers the bank." The words landed hard because they were true. A man in a reflective vest climbed down from the lead truck with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. His name was Luis Ortega. He had a thin face, tired eyes, and the cautious voice of someone used to being blamed for problems he did not create. "You, Mr. Reed?" he asked. Thomas nodded. Luis handed him the papers. "Cascade Beanworks appreciates it. Most landfill sites are charging triple for wet grounds now. Smell gets complaints." Jonah looked toward the steaming pile. "Can't imagine why." Luis gave a tired little smile. "You'd be surprised how much coffee gets thrown away before breakfast." Thomas signed the first sheet, then the second. Luis lowered his voice. "Company wants it gone. That's all I know." Thomas folded the papers once and tucked them inside his coat. "Then we agree on something." By sunrise, the back pasture no longer looked like pasture. It looked wounded. Black mounds sat where grass had been, steaming in the cold. The smell drifted over the Reed house, across the road, and down toward the neighboring Briggs farm. By mid-morning, Clayton Briggs drove up in his red pickup with two hired hands in the bed. Clayton had once been Thomas's closest friend. They had hunted elk together, borrowed tools from each other, and sat beside each other at church suppers before money, drought, and pride slowly turned friendship into competition. Clayton leaned out the window, grinning. "Well, Tom," he shouted, "I always figured you'd grow something strange. Didn't think it'd be breakfast." The hired hands laughed. Jonah's neck burned. Clayton pointed at the black piles. "You planning donuts next?" More laughter. Thomas only looked at him over the fence. "You finished?" "Not even started." Another trailer began to unload behind them, and a fresh wave of bitter steam rolled over the road. Clayton coughed, laughed again, and drove off with one hand waving out the window. That afternoon, the school bus slowed as it passed. A boy pressed his face against the glass and yelled, "Coffee graveyard!" The children roared. Jonah turned toward the barn so no one would see his face. But Thomas stayed by the fence all day, watching the trucks with the same unreadable calm. That evening, after the last trailer left, Jonah found him standing alone beside the black piles. Fog moved between the mounds. The smell was so thick it seemed to coat the tongue. Jonah said, "Tell me this is not the plan." Thomas crouched, scooped up a handful of wet grounds, and let them steam through his fingers. "What do you smell?" "Rotten coffee." "No." Thomas rubbed the grounds between his thumb and palm. "Food." Jonah frowned. "For what?" Thomas looked over the ruined pasture for what's still alive under there. In the years that followed, the jokes got worse before anything got better. By the summer of 1996, the backfield behind the Reed farm had become a long range of black hills. Thomas did not just accept the coffee grounds anymore, he worked them. He mixed in spoiled straw from the loft, leaves raked from the roadside ditches, chicken manure from a neighbor who was happy to get rid of it, and chipped bark from an old mill outside town. He turned the piles with a rented loader until steam poured out of them like breath from an animal. On warm afternoons, the smell could stop a conversation. It drifted through open windows, stuck to clothes, and followed Jonah into town. Outside Harlan Feed and Seed, men laughed when he walked by. "There goes the coffee boy. Ask your daddy when the muffins come in." Jonah learned to keep his eyes on the gravel. What embarrassed him most was not the smell. It was that Thomas seemed past embarrassment. Every morning before daylight, Jonah would find him in the black field with a shovel, a long metal thermometer, and a notebook covered in dirt. He measured pile temperature. He wrote down rain. He checked moisture by squeezing handfuls of compost and watching how it broke apart. He marked rows with stakes and dates. Jonah hated the whole ritual. One afternoon, he found Thomas standing knee-deep in a steaming pile, pushing the thermometer into the center. "You're measuring trash now?" Thomas waited, then read the gauge. 151. "That's supposed to mean something?" "It means the pile is cooking right." Jonah shook his head. "You sound like a scientist." Thomas looked at the black ground around him. "No, I sound like a farmer who is finally listening." At night, when Jonah could not sleep because the smell crept through the window screen, he sometimes saw the light on in the machine shed. One rainy night, he walked over and found Thomas at the workbench beneath a hanging bulb. Beside him lay Ruth's old Bible, a stack of seed catalogs, and 3 notebooks filled edge to edge with figures. Soil color, pile heat, rainfall, plant response, worm count. The family dog, Molly, lay under the bench with her gray muzzle on her paws. She had been Ruth's dog first, and after Ruth died, she followed Thomas like a small shadow with tired eyes. Jonah stood in the doorway. "You've been writing all this down?" Thomas turned a page. "For 2 years." "Why?" "Because dirt tells the truth if you give it time." Rain tapped the tin roof. Jonah looked at the notebooks, then at his father's rough hands resting near Ruth's Bible. "People think you've lost your mind." Thomas gave a quiet laugh. "People thought my father was ruining good ground when he planted clover between cash crops." "That was different." "No," Thomas said. "It just has the comfort of being old now." The next morning, Clayton Briggs stopped beside the field again, this time with a paper cup of gas station coffee in his hand. He watched Thomas turn the black piles and shouted, "You opening a dump or a church revival? Because something out there is rising." Thomas cut the tractor engine. The sudden quiet made Clayton's joke hang awkwardly in the air. Thomas stepped down from the tractor and said, "Dead ground does not stay dead unless you starve it." Clayton stared at him, then burst out laughing. "Tom, nobody asked for a sermon from a compost heap." He drove away smiling. But Jonah noticed something after that. His father no longer looked wounded when people laughed. He looked patient. The summer of 2000 came without mercy. By late June, the hills outside Grants Pass had turned the color of rope. The ditches along the road cracked open. Dust followed every truck like smoke. Creek beds that usually ran cold through July sank into thin, muddy threads. Farmers started counting hay bales the way poor men count coins. Clayton Briggs fields yellowed first, then the Miller place, then the Lund Ranch. By mid-July, the valley looked exhausted. Jonah walked the southern fence one afternoon with Molly limping beside him. She was old now, nearly blind in one eye, but she still followed the work as if Ruth had left her in charge of the family. Across the road, Clayton's hay lay flattened and brittle. Cattle stood in the shade of a few tired oaks, ribs showing under dusty hides. Then Jonah turned toward the reed field. The difference made him stop. Their corn was not lush like a magazine picture. It was not a miracle in the easy way people use that word, but it was alive. The leaves were still green. The stalks still held. The soil under Jonah's boots was dark instead of gray. He knelt, pushed his fingers 4 inches down, and felt coolness. Coolness. After weeks without real rain. He dug deeper with his pocket knife, lifted a clod, and watched it crumble instead of powder. Thomas came up behind him with a shovel over one shoulder. "You checked it?" Jonah nodded slowly. "It is still damp." Thomas knelt with difficulty and took a handful of soil. It broke softly between his fingers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the corn rows with a dry, whispering sound. Finally, Jonah said, "The coffee did this?" Thomas shook his head. "Not the coffee alone." "Then what?" Thomas held out the soil. "Carbon, roots, worms, fungi, bacteria, time. All the small workers God put in the ground before men decided dirt was just dust." Jonah looked across the field. For years, the black piles had looked like shame. Now they looked like a stored answer. By evening, trucks began slowing along the road. Men who had laughed for 6 years parked by the ditch and pretended to check tires. Women driving back from town eased down near the fence, looking out over the green rows. No one yelled jokes from the windows anymore. 2 days later, Clayton Briggs crossed the property line on foot. He came without his grin. His cap was twisted in both hands. His face had gone thinner in the heat. Dust clung to his shirt and his boots. Thomas was repairing a cracked irrigation fitting near the field edge. Clayton stopped beside the fence and looked over the reed corn. "I don't get it," he said. Thomas kept working. Clayton swallowed. "Everybody else is burning up." Thomas tightened the fitting. Clayton's voice dropped. "How is yours still holding?" The old Thomas might have enjoyed the moment. The grieving Thomas might have ignored him. But the man standing in the field only wiped his hands on his pants and walked to the edge of the corn. He pushed the shovel into the ground and lifted a dark wedge of soil. "Put your hand in it." Clayton hesitated. Then he crouched and touched the dirt. His expression changed. "It's cool." Thomas nodded. "Water has places to stay now." Clayton looked confused. Thomas broke the clod open. "Dead soil sheds rain. Living soil holds it." Clayton stared at the black earth, then across his own brown field beyond the road. For the first time since the coffee trucks arrived, he did not have a joke. News traveled through Josephine County the way weather does, quietly at first, then everywhere. By August, men at Harlan Feed were no longer laughing about the Reed farm. They were asking what Thomas mixed into the piles, how hot he let them get, how long he turned them, and whether coffee grounds could be found cheaper by the ton. Thomas answered some questions and ignored others. He had no interest in becoming famous. He only cared that the field had begun to breathe again. But someone else cared. Cascade Beanworks. The company had changed hands in 2001. The old managers who had paid Thomas to accept coffee waste were gone. New owners hired consultants to review disposal contracts, environmental liabilities, and potential byproduct value. That was how 3 black sedans ended up in the Reed driveway on a wet March morning in 2002. Jonah saw them first. Their polished doors looked ridiculous, splashed with farm mud. Thomas stepped out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands. Molly barked once from the porch, then lay down again, too old to keep warning anyone for long. A woman in a charcoal coat stepped from the first car and introduced herself as Vivian Cross, corporate counsel for Cascade Beanworks. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, careful, and far too clean for a farmyard in spring. Behind her came a younger man carrying folders and a soil sample case. He introduced himself as Daniel Cho from the company's sustainability division. Unlike Vivian, he kept looking toward the fields instead of the farmhouse. Vivian extended her hand. "Mr. Reed, thank you for seeing us." Thomas shook it once. Didn't know I had agreed to that. Her smile did not move very far. We are reviewing historic material placement connected to former Cascade operations. Jonah nearly laughed. Historic material placement? Vivian turned toward him. Coffee byproduct deposited on this property. You mean the garbage? Her expression tightened. Terminology matters. Thomas looked at her for a long second. It mattered less when your trucks were leaking it on my road. Rain ticked softly against the sedan roofs. Vivian opened a folder. Previous agreements appear incomplete. Cascade may retain certain interests in unprocessed material and derivative compost value. Jonah stepped forward. You paid him to take it. Previous management used informal paperwork. Because nobody wanted the stuff. Daniel Cho looked down at his shoes. Vivian did not. Thomas pointed toward the south field. Walk. They crossed the wet ground in a thin line. Rain darkened Thomas's coat and dotted Vivian's folder. The field ahead of them looked almost black beneath the gray sky, rich and soft, with early green shoots pushing through. Daniel crouched before anyone asked him to. He pressed his fingers into the soil, lifted some, and rubbed it carefully. Then he looked up. This is not raw coffee waste. Vivian shot him a warning glance. Thomas said, No, it is not. Daniel swallowed. The organic matter level must be extremely high. Thomas looked at Vivian. You hear that? Your trash changed its name. Vivian's voice stayed controlled. Transformation does not necessarily extinguish ownership questions. Thomas crouched beside Daniel despite the ache in his knees. He took a handful of soil and held it up between them. This rotted here. It heated here. It was mixed here. It fed worms here. It held rain here. I worked it through 6 winters while your company forgot it existed. He let the soil fall. You did not come looking for garbage. Vivian said nothing. Thomas stood slowly. You came because it became worth something. Within a week, the whole valley knew. Somebody at Harlan Feed claimed the coffee company planned to sue. Someone at church said the state might get involved. A reporter from Medford drove out and photographed Thomas beside the black field, though Thomas refused to smile for the picture. The headline called him the farmer who grew soil from waste. Jonah pinned the clipping inside the barn. Thomas pretended not to notice. But late that night, Jonah found his father standing beneath the clipping with one hand resting on Molly's head. For the first time in years, Thomas looked less like a man surviving grief and more like a man standing on ground that had answered him back. The final proof came that September. 2 white trucks from Oregon State rolled into the yard carrying soil augers, coolers, sample bags, and 3 people who did not look interested in lawsuits at all. Dr. Miriam Vale introduced herself first. She was in her mid-50s, sun-browned, steady, and dressed more like a field hand than a professor. Her boots already carried real mud, which made Thomas trust her faster than her title did. With her came Noah Bell, a graduate researcher with a notebook, and a local extension agent named April Ruiz, who knew half the farmers in the county by first name. They spent 2 days taking samples. They measured water infiltration. They measured root depth. They counted worms. They compared the reed field with a conventional field across the road that had received similar rain and sun. On the second afternoon, Jonah found Dr. Vale standing at the edge of the south field, staring down at a fresh soil core. The top layer was dark and loose. The deeper layer still held moisture. She shook her head. Jonah asked, "Is it bad?" "No," she said. "That is the problem." He frowned. She smiled. "It is better than it has any right to be." Thomas walked up slowly. Dr. Vale held out the sample. "Mr. Reed, what you built here is not just composting. It is restoration. The soil structure has changed. Water is entering instead of running off. Roots are going deeper. Microbial activity is extremely high for this region under these conditions." Thomas listened without expression. Jonah could not stop looking at him. For years, men had called his father crazy in parking lots, at fence lines, and from truck windows. Now a scientist was standing in his field describing that same stubborn work as restoration. The report came out that winter. It did not make Thomas rich overnight. Life rarely moves that cleanly. But it changed the story. Cascade Beanworks withdrew its claim before the first hearing. The company released a polite statement about supporting agricultural innovation and community partnership, which meant public opinion had made the lawsuit too expensive in ways lawyers could not calculate. Vivian Cross returned once more with a proposal. Licensing, branded compost, regional collection, consulting fees. Thomas listened from the porch swing with a blanket over his knees and Molly asleep beside his boots. When Vivian finished, she asked, "What part of this system are you willing to sell?" Thomas looked past her toward the field. "The compost can be sold." Vivian waited. "And the process?" Thomas shook his head. "The process can be taught." She frowned. "That is not the same thing." "No," Thomas said. "It is better." By 2004, coffee grounds that once went unwanted were being hauled to farms across the valley. Men who had mocked Thomas now asked him how much straw to add, when to turn the piles, how wet was too wet, and what temperature meant the biology had gone wrong. Thomas answered them. Even Clayton Briggs. One autumn evening, Jonah stood with his father above the south field as the last light moved across the dark earth. The land looked nothing like it had that first morning. There were no steaming black mountains now, no stench rolling across the road, no school bus laughter, just rich soil, low green cover, and the smell of rain waiting in the distance. Jonah said, "You didn't know." Thomas looked at him. "When you started, you didn't actually know it would work." Thomas smiled faintly. "No." "Then why keep going?" For a while, the old man said nothing. A wind moved over the field, and the cover crop bent under it like the ground was breathing. Finally, Thomas said, "After your mother died, I kept thinking the farm was finished because I felt finished. Then those first loads came in. Everyone saw waste. I did too at first." He looked down at his hands. "But waste is only the name we give something before we understand what it can feed." Jonah swallowed. Thomas looked over the field again. "So I kept feeding the ground, and little by little, it reminded me that dead things are not always done. Sometimes they are only waiting for life to get back inside them." The sun slipped behind the fir trees. The black soil held the last light. People had laughed when Thomas Reed covered his dying farm with what the world threw away. They called it garbage. They called it rot. They called it proof that grief had ruined him. But beneath the smell, beneath the mockery, beneath all those mornings when nothing seemed to change, the ground was quietly becoming rich again. And maybe that is how restoration often begins. Not with applause, not with certainty, not with everyone understanding. Sometimes healing starts under a layer of what others reject. Sometimes God hides renewal inside the very thing people are eager to discard. And sometimes the richest ground is born in the place the world already gave up on.